Good morning. Well, I tell you, I am feeling the love this morning in so many ways. The love that is in this congregation for one another, but also the love that you have for the organization that I work for, and the support that you've given, that you are giving today. You're serving the meal tonight, you're having me here, but also the support that you've given for a number of years. So it's a deep sense of gratitude that I hold as I stand before you right now. Thank you. And so Lisa took a little bit of my speech. I was going to talk a little bit about how I got here. No, it's okay. I'll talk a little bit about how I got here. I do want to make sure that I give some details, even though I am sure you are well aware of the work that Groundworks does. I think it's helpful to go through and just paint a picture of everything that we do, the broad continuum. And then I'd like to put a couple ideas on the table. Hopefully through this, you'll learn that I'm somewhat of an idealist, and I'm on a trip with a couple ideas that I hope will foster some questions on your behalf and that will lead to further discussion after the service. So again, my wife Tara and I moved here about 10 years ago so that I could go to SIT. We met in the Peace Corps in Namibia. We were teachers there, and we are a Peace Corps love story, one of many. We were teaching in rural schools, and after that, we moved to Japan so that we could continue teaching English. But there was something in that experience that was missing for me. It was a disconnection from this work around poverty and inequality, that itch that wasn't getting scratched by teaching English in Japan. As many people know, SIT and the Peace Corps have a strong history and a strong connection. And so when I was looking to go to graduate school, I did want to do work in international development. SIT was a natural choice for me in terms of their grassroots approach to development. So yes, we moved here with the intent of being in Brattleboro for about 9 months. Lo and behold, my wife got pregnant with our oldest son, August, and that changed everything. And here we are 10 years later. And so in that process, it shifted our focus from moving overseas to, hey, this is a community that we're looking at with different eyes. And I started doing work with Post Oil Solutions. At that time, they had a community food security project that is now Food Connects. And so I got to work with that group. And as part of that work, I went into Morningside Shelter to bring local fresh food into the shelter, which in real terms meant that I was making kale smoothies and kale chips for the community meal. If you've ever served a meal, I'm sure you know that I got lots of feedback about the kale. And through that process, I kept going back and kept going back. And as I was going back, I fell in love. I fell in love with the work. I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with the organization. And so I hung around. I was first a volunteer, then I worked the desk, the evening desk, and then I joined the board when I got another job. And then I was fortunate enough to be offered the executive director job about 7 years ago. So I was hooked on the way that they do such tough work, and now we do such tough work in a tight-knit and authentic way. And I have never considered myself an expert on homelessness, an expert on poverty issues, but rather a practitioner that shows up every day determined to ease suffering and create space for all in our community. And by doing so, I have a particular vantage point that I feel it's incumbent on me to share. So let me talk about the work that we do. Many of you are familiar with Groundworks, and you know that Groundworks, the story of Groundworks is the story of the merger between the Brattleboro Area Drop-In Center and Morningside Shelter, two long-standing organizations that worked similar ways but in disconnected ways that are now brought together. We are 3.5 years old as Groundworks-Collaborative. And I want you, when you think about Groundworks, to think about 3 things: food, shelter, and supportive services. And so the food piece of that, we have the food shelf on 60 South Main. Over the last couple of years, we have done our best with our modest and meager space to enrich the experience and reduce the stigma. and to provide as much fresh, high-quality food as we can. We support about 1,000 people per month through the food shelf. Logistically, I think it's interesting to point out that we have a box truck that is constantly moving around town, picking up food from local grocery stores, reclaiming that, introducing it into the emergency food system. And we also make 2 trips back and forth to the food shelf each week. We have scores of volunteers that help us unload the truck. If you've been to the food shelf, you know it's basically a 2-car garage. And so one bay is for storage, and the other bay is the store experience. So it's just amazing the amount of food and people that we're able to move through really a 750 square foot space each week. In terms of shelters, we operate 3. We have Groundworks Shelter, the Seasonal Overflow Shelter, and we have the Day Shelter. Groundworks Shelter, formerly known as Morningside, has 30 beds. We have intensive case management services on site, and we serve individuals as well as families with children. The goal of the program is to support people moving from the shelter back into housing. And last year, we served just under 100 people. We constantly have a wait list of people, both male, female, as well as families with children that are waiting to get into the shelter when a space opens up. And it is a high barrier shelter, meaning no alcohol and substance use on site. And I say that because it contrasts with the overflow shelter. As you know, this year as well as last year, the overflow shelter is up at the Winston Prouty campus, and after 10 years of being in the First Baptist Church. It's been a wonderful move in a lot of ways. We have 33 beds, we have individual rooms, we have multiple bathrooms with showers actually on site, which is a unique experience for the folks that are staying in the shelter. We also moved from a volunteer-based model to a staffed model when we moved up to Winston Prouty. It's also been a challenge because of primarily transportation and that the hours are limited. And so we have to transport people from the drop-in center at the end of the day, 5:30, 6 o'clock. We make 3 or 4 van runs from the drop-in center up to the shelter. Folks stay the night, and at 6 o'clock in the morning, we start transporting people back to the drop-in center. Folks can't walk up to the shelter. The last couple of years, we served about 150 people through the course of the season. And as you know, we provide a warm meal every night. Thank you very much for being a part of that process. I think it's amazing that we're able to provide a warm meal every night just from the generosity and the work of volunteers in the community. The goal of this program is to get people in out of the cold. That is the primary goal. And as such, we want to reduce as many barriers to people coming in as possible. And therefore, it's a low barrier shelter. As long as folks are able to take care of themselves and aren't disruptive to others, they're more than welcome to come in. It's a very challenging program, but I think that this program is at the heart of the work that we do to provide a safety net for our community's most vulnerable. The Day Shelter is on 60 South Main, and it's a welcoming place for people that don't have many options. So people can come in, get a cup of coffee, take a shower, actually can get mail there. So I don't know if you realize what a big deal it is to be in the system and not have a mailing address or try to be in the system without a mailing address. So that's a service that we provide, as well as connecting with friends and case management services. So we have about between 40 and 60 people a day that come through the Day Shelter. So we have food, we have shelter. Last piece is supportive services. Supported their housing case managers. They're focused on housing, search, and retention. And our case managers really support people with this long, arduous process of paperwork and searching to help people move from not having housing back into housing, and then to stay with them, a lot of folks, while they are in the housing, to help keep it. We have 5 case managers that are working with about 100 people in all different housing situations. We do outreach on the streets, literally homeless, folks have no place to go. We have case management services in our shelters, and then we work with folks when they're in housing. We're really close to capacity, but this is an integral part of people successfully getting back into and maintaining housing. A couple more things that I want to highlight real quick are Great River Terrace. In terms of case management services, Groundworks provides a 40-hour case manager at Great River Terrace, which is the collaboration out by Panda North. We worked with Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust and HCRS. The Housing Trust converted the Lamplighter into 22 units of permanent supported housing dedicated towards chronically homeless individuals. They're micro apartments, but they're completely self-contained, so about 250 to 300 square feet each. They're beautiful. If you haven't been out there, you can call out there and get a tour. We have a community space where people gather on a regular basis, all kinds of activities. And we're 7-8 months into this and seeing wonderful success there. And again, this is an example of something that works. It's the housing mixed with a subsidy, because housing is really expensive in this area. So a subsidy to help people afford the housing, and then case management services to support people in that housing. The last thing I'd like to highlight about our programs is our embedded providers. And so we're fortunate that we have wonderful collaborations and partnerships with the hospital, BMH, with the retreat, and with HCRS. So the retreat gives us a 40-hour-a-week clinician who works on our site through all of our programs to support people with individual counseling as well as group counseling, and also supports our staff, because the work that we do is getting more and more challenging, and we need that clinical support. BMH, we have a part-time registered nurse that provides medical case management and support to clients across all of our programs. And then HCRS has a part-time alcohol and drug abuse counselor that works primarily out of the drop-in center. So in a nutshell, that's the work that we do. And I think it's really important to underscore the breadth of services that we provide working along this continuum, from literal homelessness to shelters, to getting people connected to resources and housing, and then following up once people are in housing. So today, I'm trying to start a conversation with you. So I'm going to put out a couple ideas. Hopefully both are a little provocative. The first of which is that I often get asked, well, what can I do? You know, you do this work, Groundworks, how can I support you? And there's easy ways to connect, like volunteer opportunities. You can make a meal, volunteer at the food shelf. I see other folks that work for community service agencies in town, and so we connect and work together on this. But there's this other thing that I was thinking as well, two ideas. The first of which is that homelessness is not a natural phenomenon. Homelessness is not something that just is, and because it's this entrenched thing that we don't understand. We actually understand it really well. We actually have things that work. We know that homelessness is about housing. We know that it's about health issues. We know that it's about high rents. We know that it's about low-wage jobs. In this area, it's about transportation issues. All of these work together in a stew that really, this is the outcome, is that we have homelessness. We also know how to solve homelessness. This three-legged stool, and I'll keep talking about it all day long, but it's housing, it's a subsidy to help pay for that housing, and it's supportive services. And it's working here in Brattleboro, it's working in Vermont, and it's working throughout the country. It is not a mystery. It's not like cancer. It's not like something that we're trying to figure out how this works. We know how it works. And so it leads to the next question of, well, if we know how to fix it, why is it still a problem? It's still a problem because of resources and will. So this is where it comes back to you as community members. This is not a Groundworks problem. This is a community problem. And if we're going to fix this, it's going to take the whole community. We need to speak up and speak out. It affects all of us. It affects our community, and a community effort is needed to overcome it. So that's one idea that I wanted to put out. The other is this conversation about drugs, panhandling, what's going on in our community. If you're not thinking about this, if you're not talking about this, then I think you're a rare person in this town, because people want to talk to me about this all the time. It was in the paper last week. We had an article last couple of weeks about Oak Street. There's a recent drug bust there. I often get comments about, they're tearing this town down. We need to get them off the street. What are we doing about this? And this conversation's a real struggle. It's a struggle for me personally. It's a struggle for me in terms of an organization, and I know that others in the community are really grappling with this issue. I'm going to underscore, I'm no expert, okay? So take this with a grain of salt, but I do have a vantage point. And so first off, I want to acknowledge that the problem of the opioid crisis is real, and Brattleboro is not immune to what's going on in the rest of the country. In the overflow shelter this year, we've had 4 overdoses. Fortunately, everyone has survived thanks to the swift and competent response of both the staff but also the clients. They've been involved in that. I say this because it's a telling data point to illustrate what we're seeing. And we have shifted our focus, or are shifting our focus in terms of the organization, that we really have to work to save people's lives. That's a level of conversation that we're having, which is new for us, and it's intense. This shift in our approach, I think, is well illustrated by an individual named Johan Hari, and I think we're actually going to watch his TED Talk. He has a 15-minute TED Talk, basically with the title of Everything You Know About Addiction is Wrong. And his point is that we don't understand addiction, and therefore we've created a system that makes it extremely difficult for people to recover and to integrate back into mainstream society. Our system perpetuates stigma and disconnection from people who are struggling with addiction. And I don't want to make the case, I don't want you to hear that I'm saying that everybody who on the street is struggling with addiction, but I think the tenet and the underscore, the underlying thing of what he's saying fits not only to people who are struggling with addiction, but to people who are on the fringes, on the margins, whether they're asking for money on the street or whether they're experiencing homelessness. He states, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but the opposite of addiction is connection. So if you use that frame, that approach, this is very much in line with what we're hearing this morning of the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, this is the Sermon on the Mount. Compassion, love, forgiveness. If you're coming from that point, it completely changes the framework. Completely changes how we think about this issue and how we approach it. Our beliefs are so powerful. Our beliefs about issues are so powerful. Why an issue exists, it informs how we address that issue. If you think about it, like deep down, our beliefs about this issue come up into the ways in which it manifests in the world and how we address those. So we have to look at what we think about these issues. And if you think that substance abuse and homelessness is a result of an individual's moral failing, if they put themselves in that situation, then you will come up with programs and approaches that support that belief. Programs that are punitive, top-down, and paternalistic. And quite frankly, people feel that, and they respond accordingly. However, if you think that to solve these issues, we need more connection, makes for a completely different approach. Hopefully I'm not all doom and gloom this morning. And a little piece here that gives me hope is that we are seeing some of these changes within community organizations. And so Project CARES, if you've heard of Project CARES, it's a collaboration between the PD and community service providers that's looking at the stigma around opioid use as a barrier to getting into treatment. They're doing great work. There is a low barrier jobs program that is in the works, and I'm hopeful that one day we will be able to actualize that. Groundworks does not have this figured out, but we're grappling with it. One of the ways that we're grappling with it is through a harm reduction approach. And harm reduction aims to reduce the negative consequences of substance use. So what does that look like? It looks like sharps containers for needle disposal in the bathrooms. It looks like we have Narcan that is widely available. We want to get as much Narcan into the community as possible, which is, if you're not familiar, it's a nasal spray that's an antidote to opioid overdose, and it has saved countless lives in this community and throughout the country. It looks like needle exchanges. It looks like fentanyl testing strips and safe injection sites, which are highly controversial. All of these are highly controversial because it is a shift away from this punitive attitude, and let's hide this in the corners, to no, we need to bring this out front and create connections for people, to keep people safe. And we need programs that are not solely rooted in abstinence-only approaches. It's a much more realistic expression of meeting people where they're at. What does that look like, to meet people where they're at? So as a church, I think it's a perfect place to have this conversation about connection, whether through opening new doors in new and different ways, or more importantly, looking at teachings on compassion and love and how that shows up for you when you walk down the street and somebody asks you for money. How that shows up for you when you are with a neighbor who says, this town is just going down the drain. How are we thinking about, how are you thinking about and feeling about what's going on the streets? This is the kind of personal and community questions that I think we need to be having so that we can move ultimately toward healing to successfully address the effects of disconnect. So I leave you with a quote that inspires me. Do what you can with what you got, where you are. Thanks for having me this morning.